calling the June 23rd Middle Mississippi Schools Board of Education special meeting to order. We're going to open up the public hearing for the adopted budget. If you have a comment about the budget, please let us know in the chat, and the chat will be open while Chris is giving her review.
Okay, thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is spend some time going through the documents that are attached here. They're all posted online with the agenda, so everybody has access to them. If you open the binder, you'll see the narrative, which hasn't changed a great deal from the one we did at the preliminary budget. It does add all of the state reports. It kind of lists out all of the state reports that are attached or in your budget binder. And it talks about what the adopted budget is and kind of the process. If you go to the narrative and assumptions, we do a detailed set of a narrative that kind of talks about where we are, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the positive things that are going on, you know, talking about our enrollment and trends and just things that we believe are relevant to this budget process and kind of how we look at things going forward. It also has several pages of detailed assumptions that kind of go through, like, what are the driven cost rates, STRS and PERS rates? What are the assumptions, the major assumptions we're using to develop this budget, as well as our multi-year projections at the very end. And then there is a summary of the parcel tax that's on the second or the third to the last page of that narrative and assumptions. If you go to the comparative spreadsheet tab, we've got my infamous spreadsheets. And these are very similar to the ones you saw at the preliminary budget. There's no further change to this year's budget. So budget revision number 3 becomes our final budget revision. We did do a variance between this budget that we're presenting tonight and the preliminary budget. And if you look at column D on the second page, you'll see there's a $43,000 change in the direct cost transfers. So as we were rebalancing, putting all of this through our SAC software, we were able to make that adjustment. And then if you'll look over on page 3, there's a $4,966 adjustment made as well. So that actually increased our expenditures slightly by about just under $39,000. And so you can see we've made those adjustments here, and you can see what the ending fund balance is. We also adjusted the revolving cash to $30,200. That changed because when we collect all of the revolving cash that's out of the cafeteria funds, it bumped up our account. And so we reflected that here. On the restricted side, there is another change on page 5 under all other state revenues. And so what we know is the IPI, or the in-person instruction COVID funding from the state. Typically, they allow ending fund balance. And so, in other words, we get in revenues, we spend money, anything that's left over gets in the ending fund balance and becomes our beginning fund balance. But the IPI money, much like federal revenue, we realized as we're going through this, requires deferred revenue. So what we had to do is we had to actually increase the revenue in the adopted budget to account for the revenue or the expenditures in the IPI grant. So we had to assume a certain level of carryover in the 8590 from this year to next year in order to make that balance. So that's simply what it is. It's literally, we believe we're $500,000 of what we received in 21-22, we will be deferring to next year. That makes sense. So there's no other change in the restricted budget. So the certification page is simply certifying all of the documents that are here. It goes through all of our technical checks that we have to do. And this is something that we need to sign by the secretary or clerk of the governing board will sign this when it's actually adopted next week. And then there's a workers' compensation certification that just basically states how we're self-insured through workers' comp, through RESIG, because we don't have commercial insurance. We actually are self-insured, if you will, through a JPA. So we don't hold the self-insurance ourselves, but we are self-insured through a JPA. So we have to disclose that. And then the general fund, that's just the state report version of the spreadsheets I showed you. So it literally runs it through the state software. Nothing else changes, it just puts it in their format. All of the other funds are here. I'm not going to go through them individually, other to say they all have projected positive ending fund balances. And then the most important section in some ways is the supplemental information. This has a lot of good information in it. So the first forms are our Form A, and this is where we disclose what our ADA is going to be. I'm looking at page 97 under supplemental information. Font is very small in the state reports. So you can see the 2021 estimated accruals or estimated actuals for ADA, and you can see the 22-23 budget. And you can see that the funded ADA, that's 6216, I'm looking at page 97, versus the P2 ADA. So if you look at 21-22, the first column is our P2 ADA for this year. The funded ADA, you can see how much higher it is.
Mm-hmm. That was the hold on this.
Yes, that was the hold harmless. This does not include the charters. So this is ours plus anybody educated at SCO, which is down below on our behalf. And then you can see the 22-23 budget. We're estimating ADA at 5777, but we're estimating the funded ADA at 6023. That's that average 3-year ADA. So I just wanted to kind of point that out because this year it's a little bit different. And you can see the variances and the shifts and changes. So we're not getting protected at that 6216 or 6217 ADA, but we're not being funded at that drop of 5777 either. We're getting something not quite in between, but something higher. On the next page, page 99, this is the charter school ADA. So our charters, this combines all 3 charters. And this basically is estimating, you can see the funded ADA is the same as P2 ADA because we're using current year ADA for all 3 charters. And you can see next year, we're projecting an increase in ADA for the 3 charters. So that's going to help us because each of those have their own LCFF calculations. Okay. Questions about the ADA? The next few pages are our multi-year projections. And so we're projecting out a pretty healthy revenue over expense. But I also want to point out we haven't settled for 22-23 yet. So when we settle with salaries and benefits for 22-23, that will be a cumulative amount. So if we settled for $1 million this year, let's say, or the equivalent of $1 million, it'll be $1 million out of 22-23 and another $1 million out of 23-24 and another $1 million. So it becomes cumulative. And also just to remind us, we have not settled with our CSCA for 2020-21, 21-22, or 22-23. So none of that has hit. So it makes it look like we have a solid ending fund balance, which we do, but we have not built in any raises. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. I'd also point out there's assets and debt in here. That's also in the audit report, lottery form. If you go to page 115 and 116, this is the minimum classroom expense formula that we have to do. So we have to meet a minimum expenditure associated with the classroom. And so this goes through a whole set of calculations, and the system does this automatically. So we don't get a chance to change this or make it what we want. The system takes our budget and it runs through these calculations. So I don't do these calculations, the system does them. And if you look at on page 116, our minimum is 55%, and we're meeting it by 56%, 0.56. And this does not include any raises. So when we give teachers raises or instructional assistants, et cetera, that will bump that 56% up to a much higher level. And so it's really 56 is the minimum that we would be spending on our classroom according to our budget. Raises will just raise that up. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next form is the ESMO, or it's the minimum. You know, we have to meet our maintenance of effort. On page 118, we meet our maintenance of effort. And then on page 130, 133, it's kind of a little word. That's where the Criterion Standards starts. So there's like 26 to 30 pages of Criterion Standards that kind of go through and look at basically doing trend analysis to say, are we doing a good job? If we're projecting our ADA, how does that meet ADA that we've done in prior years? It kind of goes back and looks at the past and looks at the future and says, do we meet certain set of standards? And if we don't, then I have to explain it. And we provide explanations. Most of the standards we've met without a problem. The standards that we don't meet are usually when our expenditures or our revenues have dropped dramatically because we have all this COVID money. And then next year we don't have as much COVID money. So why did your federal revenues drop so dramatically? Why did your state revenues? And we just explained that we had all this COVID money in 21, 22. We're not projecting as much in 22, 23. Same thing with expenditures. We have all these COVID expenditures that we won't have next year or the following year. So it basically looks at our multi projections and says, why are you showing this big of a variance? And so then we just explain it. So that's what the Criterion Standards. We also disclose what the cost of our bargaining agreements are, our bargaining units. We disclose for management and classified. That's at the very end. And then it also just kind of talks about, do we have any risk factors? And that's at the very end. So for example, when we did last year's budget, I had to disclose that there was a risk factor of having a new superintendent. Because whenever you have a change in superintendent or chief business official, they consider that a risk to the budget. This year, I didn't have to disclose that because Matthew's finished his first year. So we didn't have that as a risk factor. And then the last thing I really want to point out is the very next page, which is right past 162. It's not numbered. This is the budget adoption reserve. So we have to disclose what our reserves are. I know it's really tiny font. This is a form that we have to use. So we just kind of talk about what are our total general fund expenditures, our minimum reserve requirement, and then what are our actual reserves? How does that compare? And then what are we doing with those reserves? You know, we have our South County Consortium reserves. We have additional reserves for economic uncertainty at 2%. So we just kind of disclose that. And this is a formal requirement that we have to do during this public hearing. So we show the budget and we show our reserves. We disclose that. And then the last set of attachments are really just some acronyms. So we just explain, because, you know, we love our acronyms.
How many pages?
So we define, it's only 4 or 5, single space, maybe 6.
Tiny font.
The school services dartboard is here. We use that. And then the common message from the county office. And that's all there is. So that's it.
That's it.
That's it. And just to highlight, just to remind you, we did not include the one-time money that was in the May revise. We're waiting for the final budget for that. Most likely we will be bringing back a 45-day budget disclosing what the impacts of the state budget, the final state budget, are on our general fund at that time, probably in August. So the first board meeting I anticipate will be disclosing that. So with that, any questions?
You explain it very well.
Oh, thank you.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. I
Someone
tried.
who is mathematically extremely challenged.
I forget, is the P2 ADA a point in time or no?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we take 88 3 points during the year. P1, which is right around the first part of December. It's different for the traditional versus the year round. And then we take it at P2, which is right around the end of March. Again, a little different between the traditional and non-traditional. And then we take it at annual. We're in the process of calculating annual right now because it's due in about a week.
Yeah. So
So
P2 is like a decimal point of a person. Why is that? It's a point in time. Or maybe I'm just confused.
What they do is they look at the total number of days. I could give a little synopsis, but they look at the total number of days through that and look at the ADA, and it's divided by that, not the whole 180.
Okay.
So you get the full benefit.
So it's not just everyone that showed up on February, whatever.
No, we look at the attendance for every single day up to our P2. And P2 is really just period 2.
Yeah.
And that's what our apportionment's based on. So the auditor audits P2.
Yeah.
A little bit of apportionment is based on annual, as it relates to non-public school, ADA, et cetera. So we work really hard at taking a close look at our P2, trying to make sure it's very accurate. And we revised P2. We've already revised it twice because if we get more information in from the
Right,
school sites,
right.
or maybe we found out that a non-public school had not reported correctly. We get new non-public schools. So if we find any kind of change, we actually report a revision to our P2 ADA.
Got it.
And then the auditors come out in July and they start auditing it right away.
Gotcha.
So, but yes, it literally takes, if it's, let's say it's 120 days. It takes every day's attendance divided by 120 days.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we actually get to kind of decide what date is P2 because we can include winter break, not include winter break, which changes the date that it ends.
Yeah.
Which can either improve or hurt. So we actually try to look at it to maximize our P2.
Do you want to open the chat or did you already do that? You did. Okay. Chat's open.
Are there any comments in the chat?
Anyone wanting to speak? No one in the chat.
There's no question. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're gonna close this public hearing. Thank you, Chris. And next up, we're gonna open the public hearing for the 2021 to 2024 LCAP and annual update. So we'll have the chat open while Tony and Lindsay are presenting. And if you would have a question or a comment, then just put your question or comment in the chat.
So we have Lindsay here to really answer questions that anyone has about the LCAP, about the process.
Was Tony presenting on Zoom or is he just?
Tony will be at the
Oh, the
meeting
next
Tuesday.
one. Sorry, I misunderstood. Okay,
Yeah,
so
so-
Lindsay. Come on up.
Come on.
Yeah, so Tony gave his update last week, so I'm just here to hear comments and answer any questions that folks may have.
I did have a question about the AP exam results. It's on page 37.
Yeah. Is that from last year? Because AP exams, it's don't come out in July.
Yeah, so those results would have been for last school year.
21, yeah.
I was more wondering about the desired results. So like spring 2020, we kind of set of numbers, kind of like a wider gap. And in 2021, it looked like it was closing, but then the desired results for 23, 24. I'm just wondering why the numbers aren't all the same. Because they're so close anyway. Like, why not just have all students trying to achieve the same percentage?
I don't think we made changes from last year's LCAP on that one. So that was just left over from the previous LCAP.
But that is a good question. We did talk about right. Why not just make it all the same? And then it was, I remember the conversation around, okay, here's what the percentages are now. We're trying to raise everyone up. But we could just go with one, say, this is where we want all students to achieve as an expectation. We want to also make it, I think it was based on where it came in the year before.
Mhm.
Statistically and raising everyone up a certain percentage.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something
Ultimately, that's
we can
what we
we
do
can look
want.
at for sure.
Anyone else have any questions about anything or comments?
I just have a clarifying question.
Sure.
The second half of the report, I just got a little confused
I,
because everything was saying that it was either discontinued or.
yes,
So I just wanted to be clear that beginning on page 69 is where we go to the LCAP being based on the goals and objectives of the district and the board.
Right.
And so you revise that so that like goal number 1 is now all student scholars will experience an excellent, diverse, equitable, and inclusive education. And then you actually move things from the prior LCAP into this one that had been under other goals. Is
Yep.
that correct? Okay.
You've got it.
I don't know whether I
And-
explained it well, but.
You did.
You did.
And the template isn't really flexible to handle
Oh, that's
that.
why you did it.
So
a
we have
whole-
to-
oh.
And we have to account for where everything was and where it's going. I spoke with the county office yesterday, and I think like some of the expenditure tables are showing up multiple times. I think we're going to remove some of those redundancies when it comes to you next week so that hopefully it'll be a little bit more streamlined and it won't be.
Could there be like a note at the beginning that there's been a revision from last year's? And so if you know, that the first part is last year's and the second part is 2020 to 23.
So we can add that into part of the plan summary. We can put it
Yeah,
into
yeah,
one of those
that would be
prompts
great.
there. That's great feedback.
I'm just going,
Yeah, I think maybe because we mention it in the LCAP highlights, but I think we can call out a little bit more
I
specifically.
think so because,
This is how you read the document now.
yeah,
'cause it's-
exactly. That it's more that.
That's great.
because It's clear that it's just that where these things go in the restructured goal number 1, goal number 2, but
Yep.
I couldn't find, you have to
Mhm.
scroll down so far.
Well, and yeah, that is really good feedback from fresh eyes on this. So I thank
Oh,
you for
good.
that.
And
Yeah.
then Lindsay, moving forward the following year, since this will be in there, we'll be able to stick with the original template, or we have to do this because it's a 3-year.
I think we'll have to
Each
keep it in there because it's a 3-year. And what I think we can do is just to make it a little bit more accessible. I think on our website, we can have both. We can have, here's the official one with all the stuff in it, and then here's actually what we're working with.
Yeah.
That's what I'm envisioning.
Any other questions or comments? All right, looks like the public has no questions or comments, so thank you, Lindsay.
You bet.
We're gonna
Thank you.
close this public hearing. All right, next up, adoption and approval of the agenda.
I move to adopt and approve the agenda.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. All right, and with that, we are adjourned.
You did.
37.
Can you explain why the